The story of human civilization didn't begin with cities and writing, but with the emergence of our species, Homo sapiens, or wise man. Approximately 300,000 years ago, a new species with unique anatomical and cognitive features appeared in Africa. This species, unlike its predecessors, had a larger brain, more developed motor skills, and a unique ability for abstract thought. Although we can't know exactly what they looked like, archaeological finds allow us to reconstruct the first steps of our species. The first Homo sapiens were nomads and hunter-gatherers. Their life was full of dangers. They lived in small tribes, constantly moving in search of food. Their diet consisted of fruits, roots, and the meat of animals they hunted. They didn't know agriculture, so their existence depended entirely on nature. The era in which they lived is known as the Stone Age, which lasted until 3000 BC. This era is divided into several periods, the longest of which was the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age. During this time, Homo sapiens invented primitive tools from stone, wood, and bones. The simplest tools were hand axes, scrapers, and knives, which they used for hunting, processing meat, and making clothes. These tools were crude, but they allowed our ancestors to survive in harsh conditions. One of the most important inventions of that time was the use of fire. Fire not only provided warmth and light, but also allowed them to cook food, which made it easier to digest and may have contributed to brain development. In addition, fire became a defense against predators. They also invented clothing from animal skins, which allowed them to survive in cold regions and later spread throughout the world. Life in tribes contributed to the development of social skills. In a tribe, everyone had their role. Men hunted, and women gathered food and cared for children. People shared knowledge and experience. This was not just survival. It was the beginning of cooperation. The first Homo sapiens didn't have houses in the modern sense. They lived in caves or temporary shelters, but this gave them a sense of community. During this time, an important transition occurred. Homo sapiens began not just to survive, but to create. They left traces of their existence in the form of cave paintings and ornaments, which indicates the beginning of the development of abstract thinking, symbolism, and culture, which will be the topic of the next part. Approximately 70 to 50,000 years ago, a cognitive revolution occurred with Homo sapiens, a sudden leap in thinking that changed everything. This wasn't the result of physical evolution, but rather the development of complex language. Language allowed Homo sapiens to transmit complex information, share knowledge about hunting, gathering, and most importantly, create myths and abstract ideas. This was a breakthrough that allowed them to unite in larger groups and cooperate more effectively. With the advent of language, symbolism appeared. This was the ability to think about things that didn't exist or weren't visible at the moment. An example of this is the cave paintings that have been found in caves around the world. These drawings depicting animals, people, and hunting scenes were not just pictures. They were symbols that conveyed stories, beliefs, and knowledge. For example, a drawing of a bison could be a symbol of good luck in hunting, and an image of the sun could be a symbol of a deity. This revolution in thinking led to the emergence of art. Homo sapiens began to create ornaments from shells, bones, and ivory. They wore necklaces, bracelets, and other decorations, which indicates their desire for self-expression and individuality. The most famous example of Paleolithic art is the Venus of Willendorf, a small figurine of a woman that symbolizes fertility and female power. These works of art show that Homo sapiens were not just hunter-gatherers. They had a rich inner world. Symbolism was also important for the development of religion. The first Homo sapiens began to believe in supernatural forces that governed the world. They performed rituals to appease the spirits of nature so that they would have good luck in hunting. This belief in the supernatural became the basis for the first religious beliefs, which later evolved into complex mythological systems. Language, symbolism, and art allowed Homo sapiens not only to survive, but also to thrive. They allowed them to pass on knowledge from generation to generation, which was impossible for other human species, such as Neanderthals. This gave Homo sapiens a huge advantage in the struggle for existence. The cognitive revolution was the beginning of our path to civilization, as it gave us the ability to create, think, and communicate in a way that no other species could. After the cognitive revolution, Homo sapiens began their great journey. Approximately 70,000 years ago, they began to migrate from Africa, which eventually led them to all corners of the world. This migration was not a chaotic movement, but a long process that lasted for tens of thousands of years. Each tribe that set out on the journey faced new challenges: climate change, new landscapes, and new animal species. The first Homo sapiens headed to the Middle East, and from there to Asia. They settled in India, China, and then reached Indonesia and Australia. This was one of the most amazing journeys in history, as to get to Australia, they had to overcome a huge distance by sea on primitive rafts. This proves that Homo sapiens had not only knowledge of sea travel, but also the courage to take the risk. The next great wave of migration went to Europe. It was a very cold continent that was under the influence of the Ice Age. To survive there, Homo sapiens had to adapt. They invented new, warmer clothes from animal skins and learned to build more reliable shelters. They also began to hunt large animals, such as mammoths and bison, which required new, more complex hunting tactics and cooperation. The last great migration occurred across the Bering Strait land bridge, which connected Asia to North America. This was about 15 to 20,000 years ago, when the sea level was lower and people could cross it on foot. From there, they spread throughout the Americas, reaching South America in a few thousand years. Adaptation to new conditions was key to survival. Homo sapiens invented new hunting tools, such as spears with tips, bows and arrows, which allowed them to be more effective hunters. They also domesticated the dog, which became their loyal assistant in hunting. This migration was not just a journey in space, but also in time. It allowed Homo sapiens to survive and develop in new conditions, which prepared them for the next stage of their history, the creation of civilizations. As Homo sapiens spread throughout the world, they were not the only human species. In Europe and Asia lived Neanderthals, and in Indonesia, Homo erectus and other archaic species. For tens of thousands of years, these species coexisted, sometimes even interbreeding, but in the end, Homo sapiens remained the only ones. Neanderthals were very similar to us, but had their differences. They were more stocky, with a large nose and large brow ridges. They were hardy and smart, used tools, and hunted large animals. They even buried their dead, which indicates their level of development. However, Neanderthals could not compete with Homo sapiens. The reasons for the disappearance of Neanderthals are still a subject of scientific debate. There are several theories. Competition for resources. Homo sapiens, having a more developed language, could cooperate more effectively, unite in larger groups, and hunt large animals. Neanderthals, who hunted in smaller groups, could not compete with them. Technological advantage. Homo sapiens invented more advanced tools, such as bows, arrows, and fishing hooks. This allowed them to hunt large animals, as well as hunt small game and fish, which made their diet more diverse. Climate change. After the end of the Ice Age, the climate changed, which led to the disappearance of large animals that Neanderthals hunted. Homo sapiens, thanks to their diverse diet, were able to adapt more easily. Interbreeding. Although this was not the cause of their disappearance, archaeological finds indicate that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Genetic studies show that modern humans living outside of Africa have a small fraction of Neanderthal genes. The reasons for the disappearance of other archaic human species were similar. Homo sapiens, thanks to their ability for rapid adaptation, intelligence, and social organization, were able to survive and spread throughout the world. The disappearance of Neanderthals became a symbolic event that showed that Homo sapiens were the only species that could survive and create civilization. Approximately 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. It was an era that changed the world. Glaciers began to melt, which led to a rise in sea level, and the climate became warmer and more humid. This had huge consequences for Homo sapiens. Large animals, such as mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, disappeared, and their place was taken by new animal species that lived in forests and meadows. Climate change also led to the development of new plants, such as wild cereal crops. These cereals, although not as large as modern ones, were an important source of food for Homo sapiens. People began to collect them, which led to the creation of new tools for harvesting and processing grain. The disappearance of large animals forced Homo sapiens to change their hunting tactics. They stopped hunting large animals and began to focus on small game, fish, and birds. This led to the emergence of new tools, such as fishing hooks, harpoons, and nets. They also began to collect fruits, nuts, and vegetables, which made their diet more diverse. These changes in lifestyle led to Homo sapiens becoming less nomadic. They began to create more permanent settlements, especially in places where there was a lot of food. This was the first step toward the founding of cities. They built temporary, and later more permanent, shelters, which indicates their desire for a settled way of life. The end of the Ice Age was not just a change in climate, it was a change in a way of thinking. Homo sapiens began to realize that they could influence nature, not just depend on it. They began to experiment with plants, which led to the first attempts at agriculture. This change marked the beginning of a new era, known as the Neolithic, or New Stone Age, which will be the topic of the next part. The Mesolithic era, or Middle Stone Age, approximately 10,000 to 7,000 BC, was a transitional period between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. During this time, people were still hunter-gatherers, but their way of life began to change. The end of the Ice Age and the warming of the climate led to the emergence of new ecosystems. The landscape changed from tundra and steppe to forests, which led to the disappearance of large animals, such as mammoths. In their place came new species, such as deer, wild boars, and birds. This change forced Homo sapiens to adapt. They began to hunt small game and use new tools, such as bows and arrows, which were more effective for hunting in forests. They also began to actively fish, which became an important source of food. They invented new fishing tools, such as nets and harpoons. The climate change also led to Homo sapiens leading a less nomadic lifestyle. They began to create more permanent settlements in places where there was a lot of food, such as the banks of rivers and lakes. These settlements were not yet cities, but they were the first steps toward a settled way of life. They built temporary and later more permanent shelters from wood and stone. A settled way of life had huge consequences for humanity. It allowed people to cooperate with each other. In settlements, everyone had their role. Someone was engaged in hunting, someone in fishing, and someone in gathering food. This led to the specialization of labor, which was important for the development of civilizations. The Mesolithic era was also a time of development of art and culture. People continued to create ornaments and cave paintings, but they became more detailed. This indicates that Homo sapiens were not just hunters, but also thinkers who sought to understand the world around them. The Mesolithic era was a short but important period that prepared humanity for the greatest revolution in history, the Neolithic. The Neolithic Revolution, which began approximately 10,000 years ago, was one of the most important events in human history. It was a transition from a nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherers to a settled lifestyle of farmers. This revolution did not happen in one day. It was a long process that lasted for thousands of years. The first farmers appeared in the Middle East, in the so-called Fertile Crescent. Here, thanks to a favorable climate and the presence of wild species of wheat and barley, people began to experiment with growing plants. They noticed that grain that fell on the ground grew, and they began to collect and plant it themselves. This process was complex, but it gave them an advantage because they no longer depended on hunting. Agriculture had huge consequences for humanity. It allowed people to grow more food, which led to population growth. People could feed more children, and this led to an increase in the number of tribes. Population growth led to the creation of the first permanent settlements, where people could live together and cooperate. Agriculture also led to the emergence of new tools. People invented the plow, which allowed them to plow the land, and the sickle for harvesting crops. They also invented new ways of storing food, such as pottery, which allowed them to store grain for a long time. Agriculture also changed the social structure. In tribes of hunter-gatherers, everyone was equal. But in farming communities, a social hierarchy appeared. Some people became more influential, controlling land and resources. This led to the emergence of leaders and rulers. The Neolithic Revolution was the beginning of our path to civilization. It allowed us to move from survival to prosperity. It gave us the opportunity to control our lives, not depend on nature. This was the first step toward the creation of cities, empires, and writing. Simultaneously with the emergence of agriculture, another revolution occurred: the domestication of animals. This process had huge consequences for humanity. People realized that animals could be used not only for food, but also for labor. The domestication of animals began with the dog, a loyal assistant in hunting. Dogs helped people track animals, protected them from predators, and also helped them move. After the dog, people began to domesticate other animals. The first were goats and sheep, which gave them meat, milk, and wool. Then pigs and cows were domesticated. Cows gave milk and were also used as a workforce for plowing the land. The domestication of these animals allowed people to provide themselves with a constant source of food, which was especially important in winter. The domestication of animals also had other consequences. The emergence of new tools. People began to create new tools, such as the plow, which allowed them to plow the land faster and more efficiently. The plow, which was pulled by oxen, revolutionized agriculture. Population increase. The domestication of animals allowed people to feed more children, which led to population growth. A change in lifestyle. The domestication of animals also led to a settled way of life. People no longer had to constantly move in search of food. They could live in permanent settlements. The emergence of new diseases. With the domestication of animals, people began to live in close contact with animals, which led to the spread of new diseases that did not exist before. The domestication of animals was one of the most important achievements in human history. It allowed us to move from survival to prosperity. It gave us the opportunity to control our lives, not depend on nature. This was the first step toward the creation of cities, empires, and writing. The Neolithic Revolution was not just about agriculture, but also about inventions that changed the world. These inventions allowed humanity to develop faster and more efficiently. Pottery. One of the most important inventions of that time was pottery. People invented a way to make vessels from clay, which they then baked on fire to make them stronger. Pottery allowed them to store food and water for a long time, which was especially important for farming communities. Pottery also became a form of art, where people decorated their vessels with various patterns. The wheel. Another important invention was the wheel, which was invented approximately 3,500 years ago in Mesopotamia. The wheel had huge consequences for humanity. It allowed them to move heavy loads, which facilitated construction. It also allowed them to create carts, which made trade more efficient. The invention of the wheel was one of the most important inventions in human history. Metallurgy. The next important stage was the invention of metallurgy. People invented a way to process metals, such as copper and bronze. Bronze was stronger than stone, and it could be used to make weapons and tools. This era, known as the Bronze Age, began approximately 3,000 years ago. Metallurgy had huge consequences for humanity. It allowed them to make more advanced tools, which facilitated agriculture. It also allowed them to create more deadly weapons, which led to new wars. These inventions changed the world. They allowed humanity to move from simple communities to complex civilizations. They allowed them to build cities, trade, and fight. This was a period when humanity began to control its life, not depend on nature. With the development of agriculture, inventions, and population growth, small settlements began to turn into cities. The first cities appeared in Mesopotamia and Egypt, approximately 4,000 years ago. These cities were not just large settlements, they were centers of trade, religion, and governance. With the emergence of cities, a social hierarchy appeared. In tribes of hunter-gatherers, everyone was equal, but in cities, classes appeared. At the top of the pyramid were rulers, priests, and warriors. They controlled land and resources. Below them were artisans, farmers, and slaves. Slavery, which became the basis of the economy in many civilizations, was a common phenomenon. With the emergence of cities, a specialization of labor also appeared. Everyone had their role. Farmers grew food, artisans made dishes and tools, and warriors protected the city from enemies. This specialization allowed cities to thrive. The first cities were also centers of religion. Temples and cult buildings were built in them, where people worshipped gods. Priests had a great influence on people's lives. They controlled religion and knowledge. With the emergence of cities, a need for governance also arose. To govern cities, laws and administration were needed. This led to the emergence of the first governments. Rulers had unlimited power, but they were also responsible for protecting the city, distributing resources, and maintaining order. The first cities were also centers of war. With the emergence of resources and wealth, there was a need to protect against enemies. Cities built walls and fortresses. Wars became a common phenomenon. Mesopotamia, located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is considered the cradle of civilization. It was here, approximately 4,000 years ago, that the first city-states appeared, which were independent political entities. The most famous of them were Uruk and Ur. These cities were not just settlements, but centers of governance, trade, and religion. Uruk was one of the largest cities of its time, with a population of up to 50,000 people. It was surrounded by walls and had huge temples dedicated to the gods. The temples were not only places of worship, but also centers of economy and administration. Priests controlled the land and resources and kept records. Ur was another important city-state. It was a center of trade, and its inhabitants were known for their wealth and art. Ur had huge ziggurats, temple towers that were dedicated to the gods. These towers were a symbol of the city's power. The city-states were also centers of war. They fought with each other for control of land and resources. The wars were brutal, and they brought huge destruction. However, they were also a catalyst for the development of new technologies. With the emergence of city-states, a need for governance also arose. To govern the cities, laws and administration were needed. This led to the emergence of the first governments. Rulers had unlimited power, but they were also responsible for protecting the city, distributing resources, and maintaining order. The city-states were the first steps toward the creation of empires. They showed that humanity could live together in large groups and cooperate. They also showed that humanity could fight to gain power. With the development of civilizations, there was a need for new technologies that would give them an advantage over their neighbors. One of the most important inventions of that time was metallurgy. Approximately 3,000 years ago, people invented a way to process metals. The first metal they began to use was copper. It was soft, but it could be used to make tools and weapons. The next important stage was the invention of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Bronze was much stronger than copper, and it could be used to make more advanced weapons, such as swords, spears, and shields. This era, known as the Bronze Age, began approximately 3,000 years ago. Metallurgy had huge consequences for humanity. It allowed them to make more advanced tools which facilitated agriculture. It also allowed them to create more deadly weapons, which led to new wars. Those civilizations that had access to metals had a huge advantage over others. After the Bronze Age, people invented a way to process iron. Iron was heavy, but there was more of it, and it could be found in many places. The Iron Age began approximately 1,200 years ago. Iron weapons and tools were stronger and more durable, which allowed people to build more advanced cities and empires. With the development of cities and trade, there was a need for new knowledge. The first to invent writing were the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, approximately 3,400 years ago. They invented cuneiform, which consisted of wedge-shaped signs that were engraved on clay tablets. Cuneiform was used to record agreements, laws, and myths. The invention of writing had huge consequences for humanity. It allowed us to pass on knowledge from generation to generation, which was impossible before. Writing became the basis for the development of science, philosophy, and history. With the advent of trade, there was a need for calculation. The Sumerians invented the first system of calculation, which was based on the number 60. This system was used to measure time and angles, and it is still used today. In Egypt, their own system of writing, hieroglyphs, was also invented. They were more complex than cuneiform, but they were used to record history, religion, and literature. Hieroglyphs were engraved on the walls of temples and tombs, and they were a symbol of the power of the pharaohs. Writing and calculation became the basis for the development of science and philosophy. The Sumerians invented the first astronomy, which was used to predict the movement of planets and stars. They also invented the first mathematics, which was used for calculations in trade and construction. With the development of writing, literature appeared. The first literary work is considered the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells about the adventures of the Sumerian king. The epic was written on clay tablets, and it is one of the most important sources of information about the life and beliefs of the Sumerians. The invention of writing and calculation was one of the most important achievements in human history. It allowed us to move from simple communities to complex civilizations. It gave us the opportunity to store knowledge and pass it on from generation to generation. With the advent of civilizations, religion became an integral part of people's lives. This was a time when people tried to explain the world around them and find meaning in their existence. The first religions were polytheistic, which meant that people believed in many gods who governed different aspects of life. For example, in Egypt, there was the sun god Ra. In Mesopotamia, the sky god Anu, and in Greece, the god of thunder, Zeus. The gods were not just supernatural beings, They were part of everyday life. People worshipped them to get good luck in hunting, to have a good harvest, to have fertility. They built temples and performed rituals to appease the gods. Religion also played an important role in politics. Priests had a great influence on people's lives. They controlled religion and knowledge. In many civilizations, rulers were considered descendants of the gods or their messengers, which gave them unlimited power. Myths were an important part of religion. They explained the origin of the world, gods, and people. They were also a source of morality, telling people what was good and what was bad. Myths were not just stories. They were a part of the culture that was passed on from generation to generation. Over time, religion became more complex. New religions appeared, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which were monotheistic, meaning they believed in one God. These religions changed the world. They became the basis for the development of morality, laws, and culture. Religion was not just a belief, but a way of life. Mesopotamia, located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is considered the cradle of civilization. It was here, approximately 4,000 years ago, that the first city-states appeared, which were independent political entities. The most famous of them were Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. The Sumerians were the first to invent writing, the wheel, and cuneiform. They also built the first cities, such as Uruk and Ur. The Sumerian civilization was very developed. It had its own language, religion, and culture. It was also known for its mathematics and astronomy. The Akkadian Empire, approximately 2300 BC, was the first empire in history that united Sumer and Akkad. Its ruler, Sargon the Great, conquered many city-states and created the first empire in history. The Akkadian Empire was known for its military might and administrative organization. The Babylonian Empire, approximately 1800 BC, was one of the most powerful empires in history. Its ruler, Hammurabi, is known for his collection of laws, which is considered one of the most important legal documents in human history. Babylon was also known for its architecture, in particular the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. The civilizations of Mesopotamia were very important for the development of humanity. They invented writing, the wheel, and many other technologies that changed the world. They were the first to build cities, create empires, and write laws. They were the first to realize that humanity could control its life, not depend on nature. Simultaneously with the civilizations of Mesopotamia, another great civilization flourished on the banks of the Nile River, ancient Egypt. The Nile River was the source of life for Egypt. It gave them water for agriculture, and its annual floods made the land very fertile. Egypt was protected by the desert and seas, which made it less vulnerable to enemy invasions. Ancient Egypt was united into a single state under the rule of the pharaoh, who was considered a descendant of a god. The pharaoh had unlimited power, and he used it to control his empire. The Egyptians were known for their architecture, in particular the pyramids, which were tombs for the pharaohs. The pyramids were a symbol of the pharaoh's power and his divine status. The Egyptians were also known for their writing. They invented hieroglyphs, which were very complex, but they were used to record history, religion, and literature. Hieroglyphs were engraved on the walls of temples and tombs, and they were a symbol of the pharaoh's power. Religion was an integral part of the lives of the Egyptians. They believed in many gods who governed different aspects of life. The most important god was Ra, the sun god. The Egyptians believed in life after death, and they prepared for it by mummifying their dead. The civilization of ancient Egypt lasted for over 3,000 years, which is one of the longest periods in human history. It left behind a huge legacy that influenced the development of Greek and Roman civilizations. Simultaneously, with the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, two more great civilizations flourished in the Indus River Valley and in China. The Indus Valley Civilization, approximately 3,300 BC, was located in the territory of modern Pakistan and India. It was known for its cities, such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which were built according to a single plan. The cities had sewage systems and public pools, which indicates their high level of development. Unfortunately, we cannot read the writing of the Indus Valley Civilization, which makes it one of the most mysterious civilizations in history. However, archaeological finds indicate that it was a peaceful and prosperous civilization that did not have significant wars. The civilization of China, approximately 2000 BC, also developed on the banks of rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. Chinese civilization was known for its writing, which was very complex, but it was used to record history, religion, and philosophy. The Chinese also invented silk, gunpowder, and the compass, which changed the world. Chinese civilization was also known for its philosophy. Confucius was one of the most outstanding philosophers in the history of China. His philosophy, based on the concepts of morality, justice, and order, influenced the formation of Chinese culture and politics. The civilizations of the Indus Valley and China were very important for the development of humanity. They were the first to build cities, create writing, and develop philosophy. They were the first to realize that humanity could live together in large groups and create complex civilizations. After the fall of the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, two new civilizations flourished on the island of Crete and in Greece: the Minoan and Mycenaean. The Minoan civilization, approximately 2700 BC, was located on the island of Crete. It was a peaceful and prosperous civilization that did not have significant wars. The Minoans were known for their architecture, in particular the palace in Knossos, which was a huge complex with many rooms, pools, and frescoes. The palace was not only the ruler's residence but also a center of governance and religion. The Minoans were also known for their writing, which was very complex, but it was used to record agreements and trade. Unfortunately, we cannot read the writing of the Minoans. The Mycenaean civilization, approximately 1600 BC, was located in Greece. It was a military and aggressive civilization that fought with other city-states. The Mycenaeans were known for their architecture, in particular the palace in Mycenae, which was a huge complex with many rooms and fortresses. The Mycenaean civilization was also known for its mythology, which was the basis for Greek mythology. The Mycenaeans were destroyed approximately 1200 BC, which marked the beginning of the Dark Ages in Greece. The Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations were important for the development of humanity. They were the first to build palaces, create writing, and develop mythology. They were the first to realize that humanity could live together in large groups and create complex civilizations. After the Dark Ages in Greece, a new civilization flourished that became the cradle of Western civilization. Ancient Greece was not a single state, but a set of independent city-states, such as Athens and Sparta. Athens was a center of democracy, philosophy, and art. Here were born such outstanding philosophers as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who tried to find answers to questions about the world without using myths and religion. Athens was also known for its architecture, in particular the Parthenon, which was a symbol of the city's power. Sparta was a military state that was known for its army. The Spartans were raised as warriors, and they were ready to die for their homeland. Sparta was a symbol of military might and discipline. The Greeks were also known for their mythology, which was the basis for their religion. They believed in many gods who governed different aspects of life. The most important god was Zeus, the god of thunder. The Greeks were also known for their inventions. They invented mathematics, physics, astronomy, and biology. They also invented the Olympic Games, which were an important element of their culture. Ancient Greece was very important for the development of humanity. It was the first to create democracy, philosophy, and science. It was the first to realize that humanity could live together in large groups and create complex civilizations. After the fall of Greek civilization, a new force entered the arena: the Roman Empire. Rome, which was a small city, became the most powerful empire in history. The Romans were known for their military might. They had the strongest army of their time, which conquered vast territories. They were also known for their engineering. They built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and sewage systems, which were a symbol of their power. The Romans were also known for their law. Roman law is the basis of the legal systems of many modern countries. The concepts of private property, a fair trial, and contract law were developed by the Romans. The Romans were also known for their architecture. They built such monumental structures as the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and numerous triumphal arches. The Roman style, which combined Greek elegance and Roman practicality, was unique. The Roman Empire was very important for the development of humanity. It was the first to unite vast territories under a single rule. It was the first to create a single legal and economic system. It was the first to realize that humanity could live together in large groups and create complex civilizations. With the development of civilizations, there was a need for trade. Trade routes were important for the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. One of the most important trade routes was the Silk Road, which connected China with the Mediterranean. The Silk Road was not just a trade route, it was a path for the exchange of culture, religion, and technology. It allowed people from different parts of the world to communicate with each other. With the development of trade, globalization also emerged, a process in which the world becomes more interconnected. Globalization was not just about the exchange of goods, but also about the exchange of ideas, culture, and technology. It allowed humanity to develop faster and more efficiently. Trade routes and globalization were very important for the development of humanity. They allowed us to communicate with each other and exchange knowledge. They were the first steps toward creating a single world. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of history. It was the beginning of a new era in which the legacy of ancient civilizations, which included their laws, language, engineering achievements, and political ideas, helped shape modern European civilization. Today we are the heirs of all these civilizations. We use their laws, languages, and technologies. We live in a world that was created by them. Today, Homo sapiens is the only human species on the planet. We have come a long way from the first hunter-gatherers to the creation of a complex civilization. We invented writing, the wheel, and we even flew into space. But what is our evolution? Modern scientists claim that our evolution has not stopped. We continue to develop. We are becoming smarter, faster, and more resilient. But our evolution is not just physical. We are also developing socially and technologically. We are creating new technologies that are changing our world. But what is our future? Can we survive? Can we solve the problems of climate change, poverty, and war? The answer to this question depends on us. We are the only species that can solve these problems. We are Homo sapiens, and our future is in our hands.